Hello and welcome back to my channel. And today we're going to start our discussion on the philosophy of yoga. It is a very prominent and widespread philosophy, and it is said to be as a contemporary or a closely allied to Sankhyan system. So, it's like a parallel or complementary to Sankhyan philosophy. Let's get started. Yoga Sutra of Patanjali is the foundation for yoga philosophy. Patanjali defines yoga as the cessation of modification of chitta or Chittavrittinirodh. So, what Patanjali defines as yoga is that it is a cessation or it is the eradication of the modification of chitta or Chittavrittinirodh. So, chitta is basically a repository of our thoughts, emotions, memories, desires, past experiences. Vritti is the fluctuations and disturbances in our mental states, and Nirodh is basically the negation. So, Chitta Vritti Nirodh is controlling the fluctuations or negating the fluctuations of Chitta or controlling the mind from getting distracted or fluctuations of thoughts and desires. So yoga is like you could say that yoga is a means to attain viveka gyan, which is said to be as the uh, one which would lead us to the ultimate liberation in Sankhyan philosophy. So it is basically the discriminated knowledge that Purush is different from Prakriti. This is what we call as Viveka Gyan, and yoga is a means to attain this Viveka Gyan. The yoga is closely allied to the Sankhyan system. It is the practical life application of Sankhyan philosophy. So what we have read in our previous videos in Sankhyan philosophy were just on a more theoretical part. But over here, the yoga system is basically trying to justify the practical life applications of the Sankhya system. It considers practice of yoga as the essential condition for attaining Viveka which is considered by Sankhya as the essential path for liberation. So, this practice of yoga is the essential condition for attaining Viveka in all. And once you attain Viveka you would be in the path for liberation. So, yoga is basically an orthodox, realist, theistic, theistic school of philosophy. So, orthodox because it believes in the authority of the Vedas. Realist is because of the practical life applications of Sankhya philosophy, which is mentioned in the Yoga. And theistic is because of its belief in God. So, according to yoga, self is distinct from mind and body. So this is in lines with the Sankhya philosophy where we discriminate between mind and body. So where we discriminate self from the mind and body, where we discriminate Purush from mind and body, Purush from all the other evolutes of Prakriti. So mind and body are basically the evolutes of Prakriti. So here it's justified to say that self is distinct from mind and body. The liberation can be achieved only if we manage to suppress and terminate the functions of body and senses. Senses are the indriyas, the mind manas, and the intellect buddhi, and finally the ego ahankara. So, in order to obtain liberation, we first have to manage to suppress and terminate the functions of body and senses, the mind, the intellect, and finally the ego. So you have to go in that order. First, you have to suppress or terminate the functions of body and senses, then the mind, then the intellect, and finally the ego. The path to it, according to yoga, is self purification and concentration. So you could attain liberation only when you are self purified and concentrated. So, like when you have full concentration and self purification. So, what is Chitta? So, we have read earlier about Chitta Vriddhi Nirodh. So, what exactly is Chitta? As I told you earlier, Chitta is basically a repository of our thoughts, feelings, emotions, past experiences, etc. In yoga, the individual self, Jiva, is associated with gross body and subtle body, chitta. So chitta is our subtle body. Gross body is just the empirical body which we have, two hands, two legs, a head. Right. This is the gross body which you get in contact with on a daily basis. Like whenever you see a person, you see the gross body of it. But the subtle body is the chitta. Chitta means the three internal organs of Prakriti, which are the Mahat, Ahankar, and Manas. So Mahat, Ahankar, and Manas, these are the three internal organs of Prakriti, and Chitta means these three only. Chitta is the first evolute of Prakriti, and Sattva Gun dominates in it. So Chitta is basically the first product of Prakriti, and it is predominated by Sattva Gun. Though Chitta is unconscious, being closest to Purusha, it has the power to reflect and appear to be conscious. So even though it is unconsciousness, but being closer to Purusha, it has the power or the ability to reflect or appear to be conscious. When Chitta gets related to an object through Manas, it assumes the form of that object. This is called vritti, cognitive mental state. So whenever chitta associates or gets related to certain object, it assumes it assumes a form of it because of like it assumes a form of the object through manas. So whenever chitta gets related to an object through manas, it assumes the part of the object or the form of the object. This change in the form of chitta, these modifications are basically what we call as vritti. Vrittis are basically the cognitive mental states. The Purush knows the world. The Purush knows the object of the world through the modifications of chitta in lines with the forms of object known. So whatever Purush knows about this world or whatever Purush knows about the objects of this world is through the modifications of Chit in lines with the forms of the objects known, because it basically takes the form or shape of the objects when it gets related to it. So whatever the Purush knows of is just the modifications of Chit. Thus Purush identifies itself as changeable Chit due to this reflection. So this is like a false identification of Purush to Chit, because it now identifies itself as the changing or the modified Chit due to this reflection that uh, Purush can only see or know the world or the objects of the world through the modifications of Chitta. Therefore, Purush identifies itself as changeable Chit due to this reflection. Just as moon appears moving when reflected by the wave, Purush appears as changing and Chit appears as a conscious entity. So this is like what they're trying. They're trying to explain that how the modifications of Chit lead to the false identification of Purush with the changeable Chit because of its reflection. So, just as the moon appears moving when reflected by the wave, Purush appears as changing and Chitta appears as a conscious entity. As a result, Purush falls in bondage. So, Purush is basically inert and conscious entity which is beyond space and time, but because of its false identification with the modifications of Chitta, it falls into the pit of bondage because it now identifies itself as the changeable Chitta, and Purush now appears as changing, whereas the Chitta appears as a conscious entity. When Purush realizes that it's completely different from Prakriti through Vivek Gyan, it gets liberated. Because Chitta is basically an evolute of Prakriti. It is the first evolute of Prakriti which is dominated by Sattva Gyan. So when Purush realizes, or when Purush gets that distinction that it is different from Prakriti through Viveka Gyan, it now is on the path of liberation. This process is called Chittavrittinirodh. So you like negating the modifications caused by Chitti. Sorry, you're negating the modifications caused by Chit. I got confused between Chit and Vritti. So, anyways, the Chit is constituted by the elements of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Thus, based on the degree by which any of these gunas dominate, Chitta acquires five conditions or the levels of the mental state. So the levels of the mental state of Chitta are based on the varying degrees of the gunas, the three gunas, which are the sattva, rajas, and tamas. So, based upon the proportions of these gunas, Chitta has been now classified into the five conditions or levels of the mental state. First is the Shipta or restless. In this state, the mind is under the control of Rajas and Tamas. State is not conducive for yoga because you are more into the control of Rajas and Tamas, and Sattvic good is not there. So this won't be a very fruitful stage for the initiation of yoga because you are in a very restless kind of uh, emotion or restless kind of state. The second is Mudha or blinded. In this state, due to the domination of Tamas, over the chitta, the mind has tendency towards vices. So because of the domination of the vices, you are more ignorant and the mind has tendency towards vices. The third is the vikshipta. So the first one was shipta, which was for restless. Second is mudda. Third is vikshipta or distracted. The mind is free from tamas, yet dominated by rajas. So, in the first state, which was Shipta, there was a domination of rajas and tamas. In the second state, Mudha, there was a domination of tamas. In the third state, Vikshipta, which is for the distracted stage, here the mind is free from tamas, but it is even now dominated by rajas. It is a state of temporary concentration where even though sattva good dominates at times, so sattva good can accumulate at sometimes. The rajas itself it asserts itself over sattva. So there is more proportion of rajas than sattva, and tamas is totally eliminated. The fourth stage is the stage of ekagra or concentrated. Chitta gets entirely dominated by sattva, and the mind is fixed on a particular object. The fifth is niruddha or restraint, the highest mental state in which all the modifications of chitta are arrested. So in the first one, first was Shipta, where we had Rajas and Tamas. Next was Mudha, where we had the domination of Tamas. Then Vikshipta, where Tamas was gone and it was now dominated by Rajas. Then we have the stage of Ekagra, where it is entirely dominated by Sattva. Like it's the concentration or the mind is fixed on a particular object. And the last stage is Niruddha, where all of the modifications are gone. So like there is no domination of Sattva, Rajas or Tamas. All of them have perished. So over here I've also added a few points on the yoga philosophy. Basically, yoga philosophy means both ends, means and ends are called yoga. So like it's a means to attain liberation and it is also the end. So yoga does not mean union of man and God. So etymologically, what we try to uh, define yoga is that yoga is the union. Yoga means union. So does not necessarily means as the union of man and God. Yoga is a spiritual effort to attain perfection through the control of body, senses, and mind through right discrimination between Purush and Prakriti. That is Viveka Gyan. So we are trying to control body and senses, which is the Indriya. Then we're trying to control the mind, Mahat, mind Manas, and the intellect, and finally the ego Ahankar. Yoga is the cessation through meditation and discipline. The cessation through meditation and discipline is called yoga. The process of yoga is what is the cessation of the meditation, cessation of all the modifications of chitta through meditation and discipline. And when it leads us to find liberation, that final stage is yoga. So, chitta is the product of Prakriti, predominated by sattva, having the power of manifestation. It can become apparently conscious and intelligent. So even though it is unconscious at first, but it can become conscious and intelligent. This is like Purush falling into the pit of bondage when it assumes Chit as conscious entity. Ekagra and Niruddha are conducive stages for yoga. In Ekagra, the mind is focused only in one object. When the state of Ekagra is permanently established, then it is called Sampragyatha, Sampragyatha Yog. So when there's the state of Ekagra is permanently established, so Ekagra where mind is totally focused on one single object, where there is full concentration, that permanently established stage is called Sampragyatha Yog or Sabija Samadhi. However, at this stage also the chitta continues to think about some objects, hence mental states are not altogether arrested. So there is some fluctuation in the mind, even though it's little bit, but there is some fluctuation or there is some change in the chitta. In Niruddha, there is no object before chitta. This state is called Asampragyatha Yog, Nirbija Samadhi, because all mental modifications are stopped and there is nothing to be thought of. Both of these are together called Samadhi Yoga, cessation of mental modifications. So, Ekagra and Niruddha, both of these stages are together called the Samadhi Yoga, which is the cessation of the mental modifications. So, first in the Ekagra stage, even though there is full concentration achieved and there is the mind is now focused only in one object, there are a few or little modifications in the chit because it continues to think about some objects, hence mental states are not altogether arrested. Therefore it is called the sampragyatha yog or sabija samadhi. However, in niruddha, there is no object before the chitta and there is a total arrestation of modifications of the chitta. All the modifications are now stopped and there is nothing to be thought of. Hence, it is called the Asampragyatha Yog or Nirbij Samadhi. Next is Chittavritti. Modification of Chitta is known as Chittavritti. The unconscious Chitta is composed of three volutes of Prakriti: intellect, Mahat, ego, Ahamkar, and mind, Manas. So, when chitta is related to some object, it assumes the form of that object, which is called chittavritti. So, it actually takes the shape of that object, and therefore there is the modification of chitta or what we call as chittavritti. Chittavritti is of five types. First is pramana, right cognition. Perception, inference, and verbal testimony are the aspects of praman or right cognition. Second is viparyaya or wrong cognition. Doubtful and wrong cognition like misconceptions, for example, considering rope as a snake. The third is vikalpa or imagination. Mere idea created by words with no real things to correspond to. So, like these are just imaginary words. They don't correspond to a real thing existing in this empirical world. For example, the sky flower. Fourth is nidra or sleep. In this state, mental modifications get suspended to some extent. Fifth is smriti. It is the recollection of past experiences without alteration or innovation. So we could now have a summary of the five types of chitta, which are the pramana for right cognition, viparya for wrong cognition or misconceptions. Third is vikalp or imaginations, for example, considering mere thoughts or ideas which don't actually exist in the world, for example, the skyflower or hare's horn, or maybe a unicorn, which don't basically exist. This is just a product of the creation of mind. Fourth is nidra, because in a sleep, our mental modifications get suspended to some extent. And fifth is smriti or memory. It is the recollection of the past experiences without any alteration or innovation. So they are praman, viparyay, vikalpa, nidra, and smriti. Due to the absence of discriminatory knowledge, Purush associates itself with these vritti and assumes that it is undergoing changes. That is, Purush assumes to be the subject of the five kinds of kleshas. So, what are kleshas now? Kaleshas are basically, it is defined as the mental state causing afflictions, afflictions like mental or emotional disturbances. So these are basically the mental disturbances which causes dukh or vedana. So these are also categorized in five things, which are the avidya or ignorance. It is the wrong knowledge of non-eternal as eternal, non-self as self, and impure as pure. For examples, uh, Purush is now having a wrong knowledge of identifying itself as something which is going undergoing change, something which is the subject matter of uh, the pleasures and pains of this world. So this is avidya or ignorance. It is like having the wrong knowledge of non-eternal as eternal, non-self as self, impure as pure. So totally ignorant view. Second is asmita, egoism. It is the false conception of self as identical to its mind. So basically, taking false pride in oneself, self-conceited behavior. This is what comes under asmita, false conception of self as identical to its mind. So whatever you have, the perception of you, whatever you perceive yourself as in your mind, and you take pride in that, that is like false identification of yourself with that in mind. Third is the raga or attachment. It is the acute thirst for worldly pleasures. Attachments, these are basically the things which bind us into this worldly pleasure so that we could enjoy the rus out of it. This is the rag or attachment. Fourth is dvesh, aversion. It is the feeling of jealousy, anger, pride, etc. And fifth is abhinivesh, fear of death. It is the obsession of clinging to life. So the five uh, mental emotional disturbances which eventually lead to sadness and suffering, dukh or vedna, are avidya, asmitha, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesh. Avidya is basically the wrong knowledge of identifying self as non-self as self and impure as pure. The second is the asmita or egoism, the false conception of self as identical to its mind. Third is the raga, attachment to this worldly pleasures or a more thirst or desire, unquenched desire for the worldly pleasures. Fourth is the dvesha, which is the aversion, is the feeling of jealousy, anger, pride, etc. Fifth is abhinivesha, which is the fear of death. It is for the obsession of clinginess to life. Thus, Purusha falls into bondage. Therefore, in order to achieve liberation, the activities of mind and body needs to be restrained. This term, this is termed as Chittavrittinirodh. So, Chittavrittinirodh is basically in order to achieve liberation, in order to have that Vivek Gyan by the means of yoga, you have to basically arrest the modifications, the mental modifications of chitta. The activities for this, the activities of the mind and body needs to be controlled, needs to be restrained. This is what is the essence of chitta vritti nirodh. So with this, we've come to an end to this video. I'll see you guys in the next one where we discuss more about the other aspects of the yoga philosophy, such as the most popular Ashtanga Yoga. I hope you would have liked this video. Till then, see ya. Bye.